If you hear your name called in the Appalachian Mountains, don't answer. If you see a figure waving from the tree line, don't wave back. And if you feel like you're being followed on the trail, trust that instinct. I'm about to share 11 true stories that will make you understand why locals never hike these mountains alone. But first, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for verified fears. Because these stories are about to get seriously disturbing, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. The Appalachian Mountains have one unbreakable rule. If you hear your name in the woods, know you didn't. These 11 true stories will show you why. Subscribe to Verified Fears right now. Because story number 1 involves an actual serial killer, and you need to hear this. When most people think about dangers lurking in the Appalachian Mountains, their minds drift to supernatural entities, mysterious disappearances, or unexplained phenomena. But the most terrifying truth about these ancient mountains is that sometimes the real monsters walk on 2 legs, carry backpacks, and smile when they offer to share their campfire. This is the story of Randall Lee Smith, a man who turned the peaceful Appalachian Trail into his personal hunting ground, and whose crimes prove that reality can be far more horrifying than any ghost story or cryptid legend. The Appalachian Trail stretches over 2,100 miles from Georgia to Maine, winding through some of the most remote and beautiful wilderness in America. For decades, it has attracted hikers seeking solitude, adventure, and a connection with nature. The trail culture is built on trust and camaraderie. Strangers share shelters, food, and stories around campfires. Trail names replace real identities, creating a sense of community among wanderers. It was this very culture of openness and trust that Randall Lee Smith would exploit with deadly precision, turning the trail's greatest strength into its most dangerous vulnerability. Smith first appeared on the radar of law enforcement in May 1981. But his story of violence and manipulation stretches back much further. Born and raised in the mountains of Southwest Virginia, Smith knew these woods like most people know their neighborhood streets. He understood the rhythms of the trail, the isolated shelters where hikers would spend the night. And most importantly, he knew that help could be days away from the most remote sections. This intimate knowledge of the terrain would become his greatest weapon, allowing him to select victims who were completely cut off from civilization and any hope of rescue. The horror began on May 6, 1981, at the Wapiti Shelter near Parisburg, Virginia. Robert Mountford Jr. and Laura Susan Ramsey, both experienced hikers in their 20s, had stopped for the night at this remote shelter, located miles from the nearest road. Smith appeared at their campsite that evening, presenting himself as just another friendly hiker. Trail culture dictated that shelter space was shared, and Smith was welcome to join them for the night. What happened next would shatter the innocence of the trail community forever. According to the investigation that followed, Smith waited until his victims were asleep before launching his attack. Using a .22 caliber rifle, he shot both Mountford and Ramsey as they lay in their sleeping bags. The brutality was methodical and cold. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. Smith had planned this encounter, had chosen his victims carefully, and had executed them with the precision of someone who had been thinking about this moment for a long time. After the murders, Smith dragged the bodies away from the shelter and attempted to burn them, trying to destroy evidence of his crimes. But Smith made a critical error that would eventually lead to his capture. He kept the victims' belongings, including Ramsey's car, which he drove back to his home in Parisburg. When Mountford and Ramsey failed to check in with family and friends as planned, search parties were organized. The discovery of their burned bodies near the Wapiti shelter triggered a massive manhunt, and when investigators traced Ramsey's abandoned car back to Smith, they had their suspect. The trial that followed revealed disturbing details about Smith's psychology and his relationship with the trail. Evidence suggested that he had been stalking hikers for months, learning their patterns and identifying vulnerable targets. He had been living in the mountains, using abandoned cabins and shelters as base camps while he hunted human prey. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had turned hiking into a predatory activity, viewing fellow trail users not as community members but as potential victims. Smith was convicted of 2 counts of murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. For the trail community, his conviction brought some measure of justice, but it also shattered the sense of safety that had always been fundamental to the hiking experience. Suddenly, that friendly stranger at the shelter could be a killer. The trail names and anonymity that had once seemed charming now carried sinister possibilities. Trust, the currency of trail culture, had been violently devalued. However, the story doesn't end with Smith's conviction. In fact, the most terrifying chapter was yet to come. Due to good behavior and Virginia's parole system, Smith was released after serving only 15 years of his 30-year sentence. In 1996, he walked out of prison and immediately returned to the same mountains where he had committed his crimes. For the hiking community, this was a nightmare scenario. A convicted trail killer had been set loose in the exact environment where he had killed before. For over a decade, Smith lived quietly in the Appalachian region, and many hoped that prison had changed him, that perhaps he had been rehabilitated. But on May 6, 2008, exactly 27 years to the day after his first murders, Smith struck again, proving that some monsters cannot be reformed. This time, his targets were Scott Johnston and Sean Farmer, 2 experienced hikers who were fishing near a trail crossing when Smith approached them. What makes this second attack even more chilling is how it mirrored his original crimes. Smith again presented himself as a friendly local, engaging the hikers in casual conversation before suddenly opening fire with a .22 caliber rifle, the same type of weapon he had used in 1981. Johnston was killed instantly, but Farmer, despite being shot multiple times, managed to survive and fight back. In a desperate struggle for his life, Farmer tackled Smith and managed to beat him with a rock before escaping to get help. Smith fled into the woods he knew so well, triggering another massive manhunt involving hundreds of law enforcement officers, helicopters, and tracking dogs. The search revealed that Smith had been preparing for this moment for years, stockpiling weapons and supplies in hidden caches throughout the mountains. He had been planning another killing spree, and Johnston and Farmer had simply been the first victims he encountered. The manhunt continued for 4 days until authorities finally tracked Smith to a remote mountain location. The confrontation with law enforcement marked the final moments of his criminal activity. The case closed in the same mountains where his crimes had occurred, ending one of the most disturbing periods in Appalachian Trail history. The legacy of Randall Lee Smith's crimes extends far beyond the 3 lives he took. His actions fundamentally changed how people approached trail safety and transformed the culture of trust that had defined the hiking community. Shelters that once felt like havens now carried an undercurrent of wariness. The trail angels, locals who help hikers with rides and supplies, found themselves viewed with suspicion. Solo hikers, particularly women, began carrying weapons and communication devices that previous generations of hikers had never needed. What makes Smith's story particularly horrifying is how he exploited the very best qualities of trail culture to commit his crimes. The openness, trust, and willingness to help strangers that define the hiking community became weapons in his hands. He understood that hikers were conditioned to welcome fellow travelers, to share resources and shelter, and to help each other in times of need. By appearing as just another hiker, he gained access to victims who had no reason to suspect danger. The psychological impact of Smith's crimes rippled through the entire outdoor community. Trail registers that once contained light-hearted messages between hikers began including warnings about suspicious individuals. Guidebooks started including safety sections that had never been necessary before. The innocent joy of encountering a fellow hiker in the wilderness was forever tainted by the knowledge that predators could hide behind friendly smiles and trail names. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the realization that Smith's success as a predator came from his intimate knowledge of the mountains and the people who loved them. He wasn't an outsider who stumbled upon vulnerable victims. He was part of the community he terrorized. He knew the trails, understood the culture, and used that knowledge to become one of the most effective serial killers in American outdoor history. This betrayal of trust, this weaponization of community knowledge, represents a level of evil that transcends simple criminality and enters the realm of true horror. Today, hikers still walk the sections of trail where Smith committed his crimes, but they do so with a different understanding of the dangers that lurk in the wilderness. The mountains themselves remain as beautiful and challenging as ever, but the innocence is gone. Every friendly stranger now carries a shadow of suspicion. Every remote shelter holds the echo of screams that rang out in 1981 and 2008. Randall Lee Smith may be dead, but his legacy lives on in the wariness that now defines trail culture. A permanent reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who look just like us. There are places in the Appalachian Mountains where time seems to move differently, where the past and present blur together like morning mist through ancient trees. Grandfather Mountain in North Carolina is one such place, a towering peak that has watched over the Blue Ridge for millions of years. But according to dozens of hikers who have encountered him over the past century, Grandfather Mountain has a permanent resident, a man dressed in clothes from the early 1900s who continues his eternal hike, unaware that his time on Earth ended long ago. The first documented sighting of what locals now call the Phantom Hiker occurred in 1923, just a few years after the completion of some of the mountain's earliest established trails. A group of hikers from Charlotte reported encountering a man on the Profile Trail who seemed oddly out of place. He was wearing heavy wool clothing despite the warm spring weather, carried an enormous canvas pack that looked like military surplus from World War I, and had the weathered appearance of someone who had spent years in the mountains. What struck them most was his old-fashioned hiking boots, thick leather affairs with metal eyelets that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than on a modern trail. The Charlotte hikers tried to engage the man in conversation, but he seemed distant and distracted, constantly looking around as if searching for something or someone. When they asked where he was headed, he mentioned trail names and landmarks that didn't match anything on their maps. His speech had an old-fashioned cadence, using phrases and expressions that sounded like they came from another era. Most disturbing of all, when they turned around after walking past him, the man had simply vanished, despite the fact that they were on an open section of trail with clear sight lines in all directions. Word of the encounters spread through the small but growing hiking community in North Carolina. And over the following decades, similar sightings began to accumulate. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. A middle-aged man with a thick beard, wearing wool clothing and carrying vintage gear, who appeared on various trails throughout the Grandfather Mountain area. He was always alone, always seemed to be searching for something, and always disappeared when witnesses looked away or tried to follow him. What makes the phantom hiker phenomenon particularly compelling is the level of detail witnesses have been able to provide over the years. Multiple hikers have described his pack in precise terms. A large, olive green canvas rucksack with leather straps and brass buckles, the type used by serious mountaineers in the early decades of the 20th century. His clothing has been consistently described as heavy wool trousers, a thick flannel shirt, and a battered felt hat that he tips politely to other hikers before disappearing. Some witnesses have even claimed to hear the distinctive sound of his metal eyeleted boots clicking against the rocky sections of trail. The mystery deepened in the 1950s, when a local historian named Margaret Whitfield began collecting these accounts and trying to piece together the phantom's identity. Whitfield spent years interviewing witnesses and researching historical records, looking for anyone who might match the consistent description of the ghostly hiker. Her investigation led her to the story of Thomas McReynolds, an avid outdoorsman from Boone who had disappeared on Grandfather Mountain in 1902 while attempting to establish new climbing routes on the mountain's notorious cliff faces. According to newspaper accounts from the time, McReynolds was an experienced mountaineer who had moved to North Carolina specifically to explore the challenging terrain of the Blue Ridge Mountains. He was known for making solo expeditions that lasted for weeks, camping in primitive shelters he built himself and mapping previously unexplored sections of the mountain wilderness. On his final expedition in October 1902, McReynolds had told friends he planned to establish a new route to the summit via the mountain's treacherous eastern face, a route that had never been successfully completed. When McReynolds failed to return after 3 weeks, search parties scoured the mountain for any trace of him. They found his base camp, complete with supplies and detailed maps he had been creating, but no sign of the man himself. The search continued for months, but McReynolds had simply vanished into the wilderness he loved. The official conclusion was that he had fallen from one of the many cliff faces while attempting his dangerous new route, and that his body had been lost in the deep ravines and thick forest that covered the mountain's lower slopes. Whitfield's research revealed that the description of the phantom hiker matched contemporary accounts of McReynolds perfectly, down to his preferred style of heavy wool clothing and his distinctive canvas pack. More intriguingly, she discovered that many of the phantom sightings occurred along routes that corresponded to the climbing paths McReynolds had been known to favor. It was as if he was still trying to complete the expedition that had cost him his life, still searching for the perfect route to the summit that had eluded him in death as it had in life. The phenomenon took on new dimensions in the 1970s when the Grandfather Mountain area became more heavily trafficked due to improved access roads and the growing popularity of hiking. Rangers and experienced local guides began reporting their own encounters with the mysterious figure, and their accounts added disturbing new details to the legend. Several rangers described finding old-style campsites in remote areas of the mountain, sites with carefully arranged stone fire rings and lean-to shelters built in the style popular among outdoorsmen at the turn of the century. What made these discoveries particularly unsettling was that the campsites appeared to be actively maintained. Rangers would find them during routine patrols, document them, and return weeks later to find that someone had been using them. Fresh ashes in the fire ring, recently cut wood stacked nearby, and signs that someone had been sleeping in the shelters. Yet despite increased surveillance and attempts to catch whoever was maintaining these sites, No living person was ever found responsible. The most credible sighting in recent decades occurred in 1987 when a group of experienced rock climbers encountered the phantom hiker on the Daniel Boone Scout Trail. The group included several professional climbing guides who were intimately familiar with both the mountain's geography and its history. They described meeting a man who matched the classic description of the phantom. But what made their account particularly compelling was their attempt to engage him in detailed conversation about climbing techniques and mountain conditions. According to their report, the phantom spoke knowledgeably about climbing methods and equipment. But his knowledge seemed frozen in time around the early 1900s. He discussed rope techniques and safety methods that had been abandoned decades earlier, and seemed confused when the modern climbers mentioned contemporary climbing gear and trail markers. Most disturbing of all, when they asked him about specific landmarks and trail junctions. He described features that had been destroyed or altered by decades of erosion and development. The encounter lasted nearly 20 minutes, with the phantom seeming more solid and interactive than in previous sightings. But when one of the climbers tried to take a photograph, the figure began to fade, becoming translucent before disappearing entirely. The climbers searched the immediate area thoroughly, but found no trace of where the man could have gone. The section of trail where they met him was surrounded by steep drop-offs and thick vegetation that would have made any normal escape route impossible. Modern technology has done little to solve the mystery of the phantom hiker. Trail cameras installed by researchers have occasionally captured blurry images of a figure matching his description. But the photographs are always inconclusive, either too distant, too out of focus, or somehow corrupted. GPS tracking devices and motion sensors placed along his frequently reported routes have recorded unexplained activations, but never during times when any living hikers were known to be in the area. What makes the phantom hiker legend particularly haunting is the sense of purpose that witnesses consistently describe. Unlike many ghost sightings that involve spirits who seem confused or distressed, the phantom appears to have a clear mission. He's always moving with determination, always consulting what appears to be hand-drawn maps, and always seems to be heading toward some specific destination. Witnesses often report feeling that they were interrupting something important, that the phantom was in the middle of a journey that he absolutely had to complete. The psychological impact of these encounters has been profound for many witnesses. Experienced hikers who considered themselves rational and skeptical have found their worldviews shaken by meetings with the phantom. Some have described feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness during the encounters, as if the spirit's eternal quest was somehow tragic rather than frightening. Others have reported feeling inspired, viewing the phantom as a symbol of dedication to the mountains and the outdoor life. Perhaps most disturbing of all are the accounts from hikers who claim the phantom hiker tried to communicate with them about dangers on the mountain. Several witnesses have reported that the phantom appeared to warn them about unstable trail conditions, approaching storms, or dangerous wildlife in the area. In at least 3 documented cases, hikers who heeded these warnings discovered serious hazards exactly where the phantom had indicated. Loose rock formations that could have caused fatal falls, rapidly approaching severe weather, and aggressive bear activity. Today, the phantom hiker remains one of the most persistent and well-documented supernatural phenomena in the Appalachian Mountains. Park rangers acknowledge the sightings, though they officially attribute them to misidentification of living hikers or psychological phenomena related to isolation and altitude. But for those who have encountered him, no explanation is necessary. They know they have met the spirit of a man who loved these mountains so much that not even death could separate him from his eternal quest to explore every trail, climb every peak, and map every hidden corner of his beloved Grandfather Mountain. In the rolling hills of Robertson County, Tennessee, there exists a distinction that no other place in America can claim. It's the only location in United States history where a state has officially recognized a supernatural entity as the cause of death on a death certificate. The year was 1820, and the entity responsible was known simply as the Bell Witch, a malevolent spirit that tormented the Bell family for years before ultimately claiming the life of the family patriarch, John Bell. But this wasn't just another ghost story whispered around campfires. This was a supernatural terror so well documented, so thoroughly witnessed by hundreds of people, that it became part of official state records and changed how an entire community understood the boundary between the living and the dead. The horror began in 1817 on the prosperous farm of John Bell, a respected landowner and community leader in the Red River settlement of northern Tennessee. Bell was known throughout the county as a practical, no-nonsense man who had built his wealth through hard work and careful management of his substantial property. He was a church elder, a family man with a wife named Lucy and several children, and the kind of person who would normally scoff at tales of ghosts and supernatural phenomena. But what began happening on his farm would transform this skeptical patriarch into the central figure in one of America's most thoroughly documented cases of supernatural persecution. The first signs of trouble were subtle. Strange sounds in the walls of the Bell home that seemed to follow no pattern or logic. Family members would hear scratching, gnawing, and knocking sounds that appeared to move through the house like something alive was trapped inside the wooden walls. John Bell initially dismissed these sounds as mice or other small animals that had found their way into the structure. But as weeks passed, the noises grew louder and more aggressive. Soon, the sounds were accompanied by the sensation of invisible hands pulling at bed covers, tugging hair, and slapping family members as they tried to sleep. What made the Bell Witch case unique from other reported hauntings was the entity's ability to speak and interact directly with its victims. Unlike typical ghost stories, where spirits communicate through mysterious signs or vague manifestations, the Bell Witch possessed a clear, audible voice that could engage in extended conversations with anyone willing to listen. The voice was described by witnesses as being distinctly feminine, with a sharp, mocking tone that seemed to take particular pleasure in causing distress and confusion. But the witch's primary target was unmistakably John Bell himself. From the beginning of the haunting, the entity focused its most violent and persistent attacks on the family patriarch. It would curse him in language so vile that even hardened frontier settlers were shocked by its profanity. The witch claimed to know intimate details about Bell's past, including business dealings and personal secrets that no living person should have known. Most disturbing of all, it began making explicit threats against Bell's life, promising that it would not rest until he was dead and buried. As word of the haunting spread throughout Robertson County, the Bell farm became a destination for curiosity seekers, skeptics, and believers alike. What they found there challenged everything they thought they knew about the supernatural. The Bell Witch didn't hide from visitors. Instead, it seemed to relish having an audience for its torments. It would speak directly to guests, often greeting them by name even when the family had no idea they were coming. The entity demonstrated an uncanny knowledge of events happening throughout the county, often sharing gossip and information about people's private lives that it couldn't possibly have known through normal means. The witch's interactions with visitors were documented by dozens of credible witnesses, including local ministers, doctors, and government officials. Unlike typical ghost stories that rely on second-hand accounts or easily dismissed anecdotes, the Bell Witch case was observed and recorded by some of the most respected members of the community. These weren't superstitious folk looking for supernatural explanations for ordinary events. These were educated, rational people who found themselves confronting something that defied all logical explanation. One of the most notable visitors to the Bell farm was future President Andrew Jackson, who came to investigate the phenomena while serving as a general in the Tennessee militia. Jackson arrived with a group of men who were determined to expose what they assumed was an elaborate hoax. According to contemporary accounts, Jackson's party experienced wagon troubles that prevented them from leaving the Bell property, heard the witch's voice clearly speaking to them, and witnessed physical manifestations that left even the skeptical military men thoroughly convinced that they were dealing with genuine supernatural forces. But it was the witch's treatment of John Bell's daughter, Betsy, that revealed the true depths of its malevolence. The entity seemed to take special interest in the teenage girl's romantic relationships, flying into violent rages whenever she showed affection for her suitor, Joshua Gardner. The witch would physically attack both Betsy and Gardner when they tried to spend time together, pulling Betsy's hair, slapping her face, and creating such chaos that their courtship became impossible to maintain. The entity claimed to be protecting Betsy from what it called an unsuitable match. But its methods were so violent and possessive that many witnesses believed the witch was driven by jealousy rather than concern. The supernatural persecution continued for nearly 4 years, during which time John Bell's health began to deteriorate rapidly. Family members and visitors observed that the witch's attacks on Bell seemed to be having a cumulative physical effect. He developed a strange swelling in his tongue that made speaking difficult, experienced seizures that doctors couldn't explain, and showed signs of what contemporary observers called wasting away. Medical professionals who examined Bell could find no natural cause for his declining condition. But everyone who witnessed the witch's relentless harassment understood the connection between the supernatural attacks and Bell's failing health. The climax of the haunting came in December 1820, when John Bell was found dead in his bed after what appeared to be a particularly severe seizure. But the circumstances surrounding his death were far from ordinary. Family members discovered a small vial of dark liquid in Bell's room that no one recognized. When they questioned the Bell Witch about the mysterious substance, the entity gleefully confessed to poisoning Bell, claiming credit for his death and expressing satisfaction that its long campaign of terror had finally succeeded. To prove its claim, the witch instructed the family to give a few drops of the liquid to the family cat. According to multiple witnesses, the cat immediately went into convulsions and died within minutes, confirming the liquid's lethal properties. The witch then launched into what witnesses described as a celebration, singing and laughing throughout the house as the Bell family mourned their patriarch's death. For the supernatural entity, John Bell's demise wasn't a tragedy. It was a victory that it had been working toward for years. The aftermath of John Bell's death marked a turning point in how American society documented and understood supernatural phenomena. When local officials filled out Bell's death certificate, they faced an unprecedented situation. The cause of death couldn't be attributed to any known medical condition, accident, or natural cause. Multiple credible witnesses had heard a supernatural entity confess to the murder and demonstrate the method used. After extensive discussion and investigation, Tennessee state officials made the extraordinary decision to list the cause of death as supernatural, specifically attributed to the Bell Witch. This official recognition had profound implications that extended far beyond the Bell family's personal tragedy. For the first time in American history, a state government had formally acknowledged the existence of supernatural forces and their ability to cause death. The decision set no legal precedents. There was no criminal prosecution of a ghost, no attempts to bring supernatural entities to trial. But it represented a remarkable moment when official bureaucracy collided with unexplainable phenomena and chose to document the truth rather than invent a more palatable fiction. Following John Bell's death, the witch's activity began to diminish, though it didn't disappear entirely. The entity continued to communicate with family members occasionally, but its violent outbursts became less frequent and less intense. It seemed as though the witch had accomplished its primary objective with Bell's death and no longer felt the need to maintain its previous level of harassment. However, the supernatural presence never completely left the Bell property, and visitors continued to report strange experiences and encounters for decades afterward. The Bell Witch case became a touchstone for supernatural research and investigation throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Researchers, historians, and paranormal investigators have studied the documented evidence for nearly 2 centuries, trying to find rational explanations for the events that terrorized the Bell family. Some have suggested mass hysteria, elaborate hoaxes, or psychological phenomena. But none of these theories adequately account for the hundreds of credible witnesses, the consistent documentation, or the physical evidence that accumulated over the 4-year haunting period. What makes the Bell Witch story particularly chilling for modern audiences is its intersection of supernatural horror with official recognition. This wasn't a folk tale or urban legend that grew and changed with each telling. This was a documented case that became part of official state records. The death certificate bearing supernatural causation still exists in Tennessee archives, serving as a permanent reminder that sometimes the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds becomes so thin that even governments must acknowledge forces beyond human understanding. Today, the Bell Witch Cave and the surrounding area continue to attract visitors from around the world who come seeking their own encounters with the supernatural. Many report strange experiences, unexplained sounds, and the sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. Whether these modern encounters represent continued activity from the original Bell Witch or simply the power of suggestion fueled by nearly 2 centuries of legend is impossible to determine. But for those who study the original case, one fact remains clear. Something extraordinary happened in Robertson County, Tennessee. Something so powerful and well documented that it forced an entire state to officially recognize that death can come from sources beyond the natural world. Deep in the mountains of northwestern Connecticut lies the remnants of what was once a thriving settlement called Dudleytown. Today, nothing remains but crumbling stone foundations hidden beneath decades of overgrowth. Rusted metal fragments scattered through the forest, and an oppressive silence that seems to swallow sound itself. But this isn't just another abandoned village that fell victim to economic hardship or natural disaster. Dudleytown carries with it a curse that stretches back over 500 years to the court of King Henry VII of England, where a single act of treason condemned an entire bloodline to generations of madness, suicide, and supernatural terror. The curse began in 1510 with Edmund Dudley, a powerful nobleman who served as financial advisor to King Henry VII. Dudley had accumulated enormous wealth and influence through his position, but his ambitions ultimately exceeded his wisdom. When he was accused of treason and conspiracy against the crown, Dudley found himself facing the executioner's block on Tower Hill. as the axe fell and severed his head from his body. Legend holds that Dudley's blood soaked into the execution ground and carried with it a supernatural condemnation that would follow his descendants wherever they might flee. The curse wasn't merely folklore invented centuries later to explain tragedy. It began manifesting almost immediately in the Dudley family line. Edmund's son, John Dudley, rose to become the Duke of Northumberland, but was eventually executed for his own treasonous plots. His son, Guilford Dudley, married Lady Jane Grey and was beheaded alongside his wife when their attempt to claim the English throne failed. Generation after generation, the Dudley family seemed marked for violent death, madness, and supernatural persecution that no amount of wealth or power could overcome. By the early 1700s, surviving members of the Dudley family had grown desperate to escape what they increasingly believed was a genuine supernatural curse. Several branches of the family made the radical decision to abandon England entirely and seek refuge in the New World, hoping that an ocean between them and their cursed homeland might finally break the chain of tragedy that had plagued their lineage for 2 centuries. Among these refugees were Thomas Griffiths, William Dudley, and Barzillai Dudley, who arrived in Connecticut and began looking for isolated land where they could start fresh, far from the reach of their family's dark history. The location they chose seemed perfect for their purposes. A remote valley in the Litchfield Hills that was surrounded by dense forest and natural barriers that would keep them isolated from the outside world. The area was difficult to access, with steep terrain and limited water sources that had kept other settlers away. For the Dudley descendants, this isolation felt like protection. They believed that by creating their own community in this hidden valley, they could finally escape the supernatural forces that had destroyed so many of their ancestors. Construction of Dudleytown began in the 1740s, and for a brief period, it seemed as though the curse might finally have been broken. The settlement grew to include several families, a small general store, and even a one-room schoolhouse. The residents built sturdy homes from local stone and timber, cleared fields for farming, and established the basic infrastructure of a functioning community. Children were born, crops were harvested, and for perhaps the first time in centuries, members of the Dudley bloodline began to believe they might have found peace. But the curse that had followed the family across an ocean was not so easily escaped. The first signs of trouble appeared within a decade of the town's founding, and they came in forms that were disturbingly familiar to anyone who knew the family's history. Residents began experiencing what they described as spells of madness, sudden, overwhelming episodes of rage, depression, or terror that seemed to come from nowhere and left victims confused and disoriented. These episodes weren't random. They followed patterns that suggested an intelligence behind them, targeting specific individuals at moments when they were most vulnerable. The supernatural persecution escalated throughout the 1760s and 1770s, taking forms that went far beyond simple mental disturbance. Residents reported seeing shadowy figures moving through the forest at night, figures that seemed to watch the town from the tree line but vanished whenever anyone tried to approach them. Livestock began dying under mysterious circumstances, found in the morning with no signs of disease or injury, but drained of life as if something had simply willed them to stop breathing. Most disturbing of all, children in the town began disappearing, not all at once in ways that might suggest animal attacks or kidnapping, but one by one over months and years, as if something was systematically harvesting the town's youngest residents. The curse struck the town's leading families through mysterious tragedies, Abiel Dudley, one of the founding fathers, was found in his home under unexplained circumstances, with no signs of violence or illness. His wife, Sarah, met a similar mysterious fate just 3 months later in the surrounding forest, despite having shown no previous signs of distress. The pattern continued with other founding families. Gershom Hollister, who had married into the Dudley line, lost his entire family to what appeared to be a plague that affected no other settlements in the region. His wife and children died within days of each other, displaying symptoms that local doctors had never seen before. High fevers accompanied by delirium, in which victims claimed to see dead relatives calling to them from the forest. Hollister himself survived the mysterious illness, but was found months later wandering naked through the woods, completely mad and unable to recognize even his closest friends. As word of these tragedies spread to neighboring settlements, Dudleytown found itself increasingly isolated. Merchants stopped making deliveries to the cursed village. Ministers refused to conduct services there. And even family members living in other towns began avoiding contact with Dudleytown residents. The isolation that had once seemed like protection now became a trap, cutting the town off from sources of help and leaving its remaining inhabitants to face the supernatural persecution alone. The most documented case of the curse's power involved the Cornwall family, who arrived in Dudleytown in the 1790s, unaware of the town's dark history. Nathaniel Cornwall was a successful businessman who had purchased property in the valley as an investment, planning to establish a profitable farming operation. Within months of moving his family to Dudleytown, Cornwall began experiencing the same mental disturbances that had affected other residents. But his case was different. Instead of succumbing to madness, Cornwall fought against the supernatural influence and kept detailed records of his experiences. Cornwall's journals, which survived the town's eventual abandonment, provide a chilling first-hand account of how the curse operated. He described hearing voices calling his name from the forest, voices that sounded like deceased family members trying to lure him away from his home. He wrote about finding strange symbols carved into trees around his property, symbols that seemed to change or multiply when he wasn't looking directly at them. Most disturbing of all, he documented instances where he would wake up in locations far from his house with no memory of how he had gotten there, often finding himself standing at the edge of dangerous cliffs or deep ravines, as if something had been leading him toward his death. Cornwall's resistance to the curse seemed to enrage whatever supernatural forces controlled Dudleytown, and the persecution of his family intensified. His wife began sleepwalking, often found wandering the forest in her nightgown during the coldest winter nights. His children developed an intense fear of their own home, refusing to sleep alone and claiming that the dark man visited their rooms at night to whisper terrible things about their family's future. Eventually, even Cornwall's determination wasn't enough to withstand the supernatural assault, and he moved his family away from Dudleytown, abandoning his property and investment rather than risk their lives further. By the early 1800s, Dudleytown was essentially dead. The few remaining residents had either fled or succumbed to the various forms of tragedy that seemed to be the curse's specialty. Houses stood empty, their windows dark and their doors hanging open, as if the occupants had fled in the middle of daily activities. Crops rotted in fields that no one dared to harvest, and the carefully maintained roads began to disappear under encroaching vegetation. The town that had been built as a refuge from an ancient curse had become its greatest monument, a testament to the power of supernatural forces to destroy even the most determined human efforts. But the abandonment of Dudleytown didn't end its story. In many ways, it marked the beginning of a new chapter in the curse's evolution. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, The empty settlement became a destination for curiosity seekers, paranormal investigators, and thrill seekers who were drawn by the town's dark reputation. Most of these visitors left with stories of their own supernatural encounters, reporting everything from disembodied voices and phantom figures to overwhelming feelings of dread and despair that seemed to emanate from the ruins themselves. Modern investigations of Dudleytown have been hampered by the fact that the area is now privately owned and strictly off-limits to the public. The current property owners have erected barriers and warning signs, and local law enforcement regularly patrols the area to prevent trespassing. Official explanations for these restrictions focus on safety concerns and environmental protection, but many locals believe the real reason is that the curse remains active and dangerous. They point to the fact that even professional researchers and film crews have been denied access to the site, suggesting that something more than ordinary property rights is being protected. Those who have managed to gain authorized access to Dudleytown in recent decades have reported experiences that suggest Edmund Dudley's curse continues to manifest nearly 300 years after the town's founding. Researchers have documented unexplained equipment failures, sudden temperature drops, and electromagnetic anomalies that seem to center on the locations where the town's most tragic events occurred. Several investigators have reported feeling physically ill while exploring the ruins, experiencing symptoms that disappear as soon as they leave the area, but return if they attempt to spend extended time at the site. Perhaps most disturbing of all are the reports from genealogists who have attempted to trace the descendants of Dudleytown's original families. Their research has revealed patterns of tragedy, mental illness, and premature death that continue to affect Dudley bloodline descendants to this day. Even among family members who have never heard of the Connecticut settlement or its cursed history. The curse that began with Edmund Dudley's execution appears to be a living force that adapts and evolves, finding new ways to torment each generation while maintaining its fundamental character of supernatural persecution. Today, Dudleytown stands as one of the most compelling examples of how historical trauma can create lasting supernatural phenomena. The curse that destroyed a 16th-century English nobleman has proven to be remarkably persistent, surviving transportation across an ocean, the passage of centuries, and the complete destruction of the community it targeted. For those who study such phenomena, Dudleytown represents the ultimate proof that some forms of evil are truly eternal, capable of pursuing their victims across generations and continents with a patience and determination that defies human understanding. In the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia stands a weathered stone marker that tells one of the most heartbreaking stories in Appalachian history. The inscription is simple and devastating. Audie Klein Powell, aged 4 years, 11 months, 15 days. Lost on Bluff Mountain, November 9th, 1891. But for over a century, hikers, hunters, and locals have reported that little Audie Powell never truly disappeared. Instead, witnesses claim he continues his eternal search through the mountain wilderness, a 4-year-old spirit forever wandering the treacherous slopes and dark hollows, calling out for his family in a voice that echoes through the valleys like a wound that refuses to heal. The tragedy that created this enduring supernatural phenomenon began on what should have been an ordinary school day in November 1891. Audie Powell was the youngest student at the Flat Top School, a one-room building that served the scattered mountain communities around Floyd County, Virginia. Despite his tender age, Audie was known for his independence and curiosity, traits that were both admired and worried over by his family and teachers. On that fateful November morning, Audie had walked to school as usual, following the familiar mountain paths that connected his family's cabin to the schoolhouse several miles away. But something went wrong during what should have been a routine day of lessons. According to the teacher's account, Adi became restless and distracted during the afternoon session, repeatedly asking to go outside. When he was finally given permission to step out briefly, the little boy simply vanished. One moment he was there. The next, he had disappeared into the vast wilderness that surrounded the small school. The teacher initially assumed he had started walking home early, a not uncommon occurrence among the mountain children who were accustomed to traveling the forest paths alone. When Adi failed to arrive home that evening, his family knew immediately that something terrible had happened. Mountain children might take liberties with school attendance, but they never failed to return home by nightfall. The dangers of the wilderness after dark were too well known, and even the most independent child understood that survival depended on finding shelter before the sun disappeared behind the ridgelines. Adi's parents, along with neighbors and extended family members, began searching the area around the school, calling his name and following every path and game trail they could find. What began as a family search quickly escalated into one of the largest rescue operations in the region's history. Word of the missing child spread throughout the mountain communities, and hundreds of volunteers joined the effort. Professional hunters who knew every ridge and hollow for miles around volunteered their services. Bloodhounds were brought in from as far away as Richmond to follow Adi's scent. Local ministers organized prayer vigils while search parties combed through increasingly remote and dangerous terrain. The search revealed just how treacherous the landscape around Bluff Mountain truly was. The area was honeycombed with deep ravines, hidden caves, and cliff faces that could prove fatal to anyone who lost their footing. Dense laurel thickets created natural mazes where even experienced woodsmen could become disoriented. Most dangerous of all were the numerous abandoned mine shafts and cave systems that dotted the mountain. Dark openings that could swallow a small child without leaving any trace. As days stretched into weeks, the search took on an increasingly desperate character. Volunteers worked in shifts around the clock, using torches and lanterns to continue the hunt even after darkness fell. Every ravine was explored, every cave system mapped and searched, every possible hiding place investigated. The bloodhounds picked up Adi's scent trail multiple times, but it always seemed to disappear at rocky outcroppings or stream crossings, where the trail became impossible to follow. The most promising lead came nearly 2 weeks after Adi's disappearance, when a hunter reported finding small footprints in a muddy creek bed several miles from the school. The prints appeared to be the right size for a 4-year-old, and they followed the creek upstream towards some of the most remote and inaccessible parts of Bluff Mountain. Search teams immediately concentrated their efforts in this area, but the terrain was so difficult that progress was measured in yards rather than miles. Steep slopes, fallen trees, and thick undergrowth made travel extremely slow and dangerous. The discovery that would haunt searchers for generations came when a group of volunteers found evidence of what appeared to be a temporary shelter high on the mountain slopes. Hidden beneath a rocky overhang, they discovered a small nest-like arrangement of leaves and branches that seemed too deliberate to be natural. Mixed in with the organic debris were fragments of cloth that matched the description of Adi's clothing. Most disturbing of all, the shelter showed signs of recent use, as if someone had been returning to it repeatedly. But it was the discovery of Adi's small handprint, pressed into a muddy section of rock face near the shelter, that convinced searchers they were on the right trail. The handprint was perfectly preserved, protected by the overhang from rain and weather. And it appeared to be reaching upward, as if the child had been trying to climb to higher ground. The image of a 4-year-old attempting to scale the treacherous mountain face, alone and frightened, became a symbol of the tragedy that would haunt the community for decades. Despite the evidence that Audie had survived at least several days on the mountain, the search teams never found the boy himself. Winter weather eventually forced the suspension of active search operations, though family members and volunteers continued to look for any sign of the missing child well into the following spring. As months passed without any resolution, the community was forced to accept that little Audie Powell had joined the ranks of those claimed by the unforgiving Appalachian wilderness. But the story didn't end with the official suspension of the search. Within a year of Audie's disappearance, hunters and travelers in the Bluff Mountain area began reporting strange encounters that suggested the lost child's story was far from over. The first documented sighting occurred in the fall of 1892, when a fur trapper reported seeing a small figure in tattered clothing moving through the forest near the area where Audie's shelter had been found. The figure appeared to be a young child, but when the trapper called out and tried to approach, it vanished into the dense undergrowth with an unnatural speed and silence. Similar sightings accumulated over the following decades, and they followed remarkably consistent patterns. Witnesses described seeing a small child, always alone, always in the same general area of Bluff Mountain, where the search had concentrated. The child appeared to be wearing clothes that matched descriptions of what Audie had been wearing on the day he disappeared, though the garments seemed to be in a constant state of decay and repair, as if time affected them differently than it did the physical world. What made these sightings particularly disturbing was the behavior witnesses described. The child figure didn't behave like a normal lost child would behave. Instead of crying or seeking help from adults, it seemed to be conducting its own methodical search of the mountainside. Witnesses reported seeing the small figure moving in deliberate patterns, checking under rocks, peering into cave openings, and examining areas where a frightened child might try to hide. It was as if Audie was still looking for something or someone, still trying to solve the puzzle of his own disappearance. The most credible modern sighting occurred in 1967, when a team of experienced hikers encountered what they initially thought was a lost child during a weekend backpacking trip. The hikers were following a well-marked trail when they noticed a small figure ahead of them on the path. Thinking they had found a child who had wandered away from a family camping group, they hurried to catch up and offer assistance. But as they got closer, they realized something was terribly wrong with what they were seeing. The child appeared to be wearing clothes from a much earlier era. Rough, homespun fabric and shoes that looked like they had been hand-cobbled rather than manufactured. More disturbing still, the child seemed to be translucent in the dappled forest light, becoming more or less visible depending on the angle of observation. When the hikers called out, the figure turned toward them, revealing a face that was both heartbreakingly young and impossibly old, as if decades of searching had aged the spirit beyond its physical years. The encounter lasted only a few moments before the figure began to fade, becoming increasingly transparent until it disappeared entirely. But in those brief moments, the hikers reported hearing the child speak a single word in a voice that carried across the mountainside like an echo from the past. Mama. The word was filled with such longing and confusion that it left the witnesses emotionally shaken for days afterward. Modern paranormal investigators who have studied the Audie Powell phenomenon have noted several unique characteristics that set it apart from typical ghost sightings. Unlike many spirits who are said to be trapped by traumatic deaths, Audie appears to be driven by purpose rather than trauma. Witnesses consistently describe the spirit as being actively engaged in searching behavior, suggesting that the child's consciousness remains focused on finding his way home rather than reliving the moment of his death. This active, purposeful behavior has led some researchers to theorize that Audie's spirit may be trapped in a kind of temporal loop, forever reliving those desperate days when he was lost on the mountain and trying to find his way back to safety. The theory suggests that the child's intense desire to return home was so powerful that it created a supernatural imprint that continues to play out more than a century later. Perhaps most heartbreaking of all are the reports from witnesses who claim to have tried to communicate with Audie's spirit. Several people have reported attempting to help the lost child, calling out directions or trying to guide the spirit towards safety. In every case, the spirit appears to hear and respond to these offers of help, turning toward the witnesses with expressions of hope and gratitude. But the moment anyone tries to physically approach or touch the spirit, it fades away, leaving helpers with the devastating realization that this is a child they can see but never save. The emotional impact of these encounters has been profound for many witnesses. Adults who consider themselves rational and skeptical have found themselves reduced to tears by meetings with Audie's spirit, overwhelmed by the tragedy of a child who has been searching for his family for over a century. Some have reported returning to the area repeatedly, hoping to find some way to help the lost spirit find peace, only to discover that their own presence seems to cause the child to disappear. Today, the stone marker commemorating Audie Klein Powell stands as both a memorial to a tragic loss and a warning about the dangers that lurk in the Appalachian wilderness. But for those who have encountered the lost child's spirit, the marker represents something more profound. Evidence that some forms of love and determination are so powerful that they can transcend death itself. Audie Powell may have died on Bluff Mountain more than 130 years ago, but his search for home continues, a testament to the eternal bond between a child and the family he will never stop trying to reach. In the remote wilderness of northern Maine, where the Appalachian Mountains begin their ancient march toward the Canadian border, lies a small body of water known as Pierce Pond. To most hikers following the Appalachian Trail, it's nothing more than a scenic rest stop, a place to filter water and enjoy a brief respite from the challenging terrain that defines this section of the trail. But to those who have encountered him, Pierce Pond is forever marked as the domain of a solitary fisherman who died decades ago, yet continues to cast his line into waters that no longer hold the fish he once sought. The story of Pierce Pond's permanent resident begins in the 1950s, during an era when the remote lakes and streams of central Maine still offered some of the finest fishing in New England. Harold Whitmore was a man obsessed with the pursuit of native brook trout, spending every available moment exploring the most isolated waters he could reach. Unlike the weekend anglers who crowded the accessible lakes and streams, Whitmore was drawn to places that required days of hiking through unmarked wilderness, locations where the fish had never seen a lure, and the fishing could be extraordinary for those willing to make the effort. Pierce Pond represented the pinnacle of Whitmore's fishing ambitions. The remote lake required a grueling 2-day hike through some of Maine's most challenging terrain, but it was rumored to hold brook trout of legendary size, fish that had grown fat and old in waters rarely disturbed by human presence. Whitmore had first discovered the pond in 1952 during a solo exploration trip, and the fishing had been so spectacular that he immediately began planning return visits. Over the following years, he made the difficult journey to Pierce Pond at least twice each season, often spending a week or more camped on its shores. What made Whitmore's relationship with Pierce Pond unusual was his methodical approach to fishing the water. Unlike casual anglers who might try different spots randomly, Whitmore had developed a systematic strategy for working every section of the pond. He had mapped the underwater structure, identified the best feeding areas, and even documented the seasonal patterns of the fish he pursued. His fishing logs from this period, discovered years later by his family, reveal an almost scientific dedication to understanding every aspect of the pond's ecosystem. But Whitmore's obsession with Pierce Pond went beyond simple fishing enthusiasm. Family members later recalled that he spoke about the place with an intensity that bordered on reverence, describing it as the most perfect fishing water he had ever encountered. He would spend hours studying topographic maps and planning his trips, calculating the best times to visit based on weather patterns, moon phases, and seasonal fish behavior. For Whitmore, Pierce Pond wasn't just a fishing destination. It was a sacred place where he felt more connected to the natural world than anywhere else on Earth. The last documented trip Harold Whitmore made to Pierce Pond began in September 1958, during what should have been the prime season for fall fishing. He had planned a 10-day solo expedition, longer than his usual visits, and had told his family he hoped to finally land the massive brook trout he had been pursuing for years. Whitmore was an experienced woodsman who had been making similar trips for decades, and his family had no concerns about his ability to handle the challenges of wilderness camping and navigation. When Whitmore failed to return on his scheduled date, search parties were organized to investigate. The terrain around Pierce Pond made search operations extremely difficult, but eventually rescue teams located his campsite on the pond's northern shore. They found his tent properly erected, his fishing gear carefully organized, and his supplies still intact. Most puzzling of all, they discovered his fishing log with entries dated up to the day before his scheduled departure, entries that indicated he had been having excellent fishing success and was looking forward to one final morning on the water. But Harold Whitmore himself was never found. Despite extensive searches of the pond and surrounding area, no trace of his body was ever recovered. The official conclusion was that he had somehow fallen into the pond while fishing and drowned, with his body sinking into the deep water or being carried away by the outlet stream. For his family, this explanation provided some closure, though they were haunted by the fact that Whitmore was an excellent swimmer and had never shown any signs of being careless around water. The first reported sighting of what locals now call the Pierce Pond ghost occurred less than a year after Whitmore's disappearance. A group of hikers following the Appalachian Trail stopped at the pond to rest and filter water when they noticed a figure standing in the shallows on the far shore. Through binoculars, they could see that it was a middle-aged man wearing vintage fishing gear and wielding what appeared to be a classic bamboo fly rod. The figure was methodically working the water with the practiced movements of an expert angler, casting and retrieving with a rhythm that suggested years of experience. The hikers called out to the fisherman, thinking he might be able to provide information about trail conditions or local fishing regulations. But the figure didn't respond to their calls, continuing his fishing as if he hadn't heard them. When the hikers began walking around the pond to get closer, they were amazed to see the fisherman simply fade away, becoming increasingly transparent until he disappeared entirely. The water where he had been standing showed no ripples or disturbance, as if no one had ever been there at all. Over the following decades, similar sightings accumulated with remarkable consistency. Hikers, hunters, and occasional fishing enthusiasts reported encountering the same figure at Pierce Pond, always engaged in the same methodical fishing behavior. The descriptions were so consistent that witnesses could have been describing the same person seen on the same day, despite the fact that sightings were separated by months or even years. The ghost was always described as a middle-aged man with graying hair, wearing a plaid wool shirt and canvas fishing vest, and carrying vintage equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than on a modern fishing trip. What made the Pierce Pond sightings particularly compelling was the behavior witnesses described. Unlike many ghost encounters that involve brief, startling appearances, the Pierce Pond fisherman seemed completely absorbed in his activity, fishing with the focus and determination of someone who had all the time in the world. Witnesses reported watching him for extended periods, observing his technique and noting the professional way he worked different sections of the pond. Some even claimed to see fish rising to his lures, though others insisted that the water around the ghost remained perfectly still. The most detailed encounter with the Pierce Pond ghost was reported by experienced angler Thomas Mackenzie in 1987. Mackenzie was an accomplished fisherman who had specifically hiked to Pierce Pond, hoping to experience some of the legendary fishing that had drawn Harold Whitmore decades earlier. He arrived at the pond in the early morning and was setting up his own fishing gear when he noticed another angler already working the water on the opposite shore. Mackenzie spent several hours observing the other fishermen, initially assuming he was dealing with a fellow angler who had arrived earlier. But as the morning progressed, he began to notice disturbing details about the distant figure. The man never seemed to take breaks, never stopped to rest or eat, and never changed his position along the shoreline. Most unnaturally, he appeared to be fishing in the exact same spot repeatedly, casting to the same location over and over with mechanical precision. When Mackenzie finally decided to wade across a shallow section of the pond to introduce himself, he got close enough to see the other fishermen clearly for the first time. The man was wearing clothes that looked like they had been purchased decades earlier, and his fishing equipment was vintage gear that Mackenzie recognized from old sporting goods catalogs. Most disturbing of all, the fisherman seemed to be translucent in the morning light, solid enough to cast a shadow, but somehow not entirely present in the physical world. As Mackenzie approached within speaking distance, the ghostly fisherman finally acknowledged his presence, turning to face him with an expression of profound sadness and confusion. According to Mackenzie's account, the spirit spoke in a voice that seemed to come from a great distance, asking whether the fish were still biting and mentioning that he had been waiting for the morning hatch to begin. When Mackenzie tried to engage him in further conversation, the ghost began to fade, becoming increasingly transparent until only his voice remained, still asking about fishing conditions as it echoed across the water. Modern paranormal investigators who have studied the Pierce Pond phenomenon have noted several unique characteristics that distinguish it from typical ghost sightings. The spirit appears to be locked in a behavior pattern that reflects his earthly obsession, suggesting that some aspect of Harold Whitmore's consciousness remains focused on the activity that gave his life meaning. Unlike many ghosts who seem distressed or agitated, the Pierce Pond fisherman appears to be at peace, content to continue his eternal pursuit of the perfect catch. This peaceful quality has led some researchers to theorize that the Pierce Pond ghost represents a form of supernatural wish fulfillment, a spirit who found a way to continue doing what he loved most even after death. The theory suggests that Whitmore's profound connection to the pond and his passion for fishing created a spiritual imprint so strong that it allowed some aspect of his consciousness to remain tied to the location indefinitely. Perhaps most intriguingly, several witnesses have reported that the Pierce Pond ghost seems to be having genuine success in his eternal fishing efforts. Multiple observers have claimed to see the spirit's rod bend with the weight of fish, and some have even reported seeing him land and release brook trout that appeared to be of exceptional size. Whether these fish are also supernatural manifestations, or whether the ghost somehow retains the ability to interact with living creatures, remains one of the most puzzling aspects of the phenomenon. Today, Pierce Pond continues to attract both serious anglers and curious paranormal enthusiasts, though the fishing itself has declined significantly since Harold Whitmore's era. Environmental changes, increased fishing pressure, and natural population cycles have reduced the pond's legendary brook trout population to a fraction of what it once was. But for those who encounter the Pierce Pond ghost, the spirit's presence serves as a connection to an earlier time when the remote waters of Maine offered fishing experiences that bordered on the mystical. The enduring presence of Harold Whitmore's spirit at Pierce Pond raises profound questions about the nature of passion and the bonds that tie us to the places we love most. His story suggests that some connections to the natural world are so powerful that they transcend death itself, creating supernatural phenomena that preserve not just memory, but active engagement with the activities that defined a person's earthly existence. For the ghostly fishermen of Pierce Pond, death was not an ending, but simply a transition to a different form of the pursuit that had always given his life meaning. Deep in the hollows of eastern Kentucky, where the mountains rise like ancient guardians over scattered homesteads and forgotten mining towns, there exists a phenomenon that has haunted locals for over 4 decades. It involves a figure that appears along the winding mountain roads, particularly on nights when the air is thick with humidity and the scent of wood smoke drifts down from the ridgelines. Witnesses describe encountering a man whose clothes are charred and smoking, whose skin bears the terrible marks of recent burns, and whose eyes hold the vacant stare of someone who died in agony but refuses to accept that death. This is the story of the Scorched Man, a spirit born from one of the most tragic house fires in Appalachian history, whose appearances seem to coincide with an unsettling pattern that has left even skeptics questioning the boundary between coincidence and supernatural intervention. The origins of the Scorched Man can be traced back to the winter of 1983, when a devastating fire consumed the Miller family homestead in the remote hills outside Hazard, Kentucky. The Miller house had stood for 3 generations, a sturdy 2-story structure built from local timber and field stone that had weathered countless storms and harsh mountain winters. But on the night of February 14th, what began as a routine evening turned into a nightmare that would echo through the supernatural folklore of the region for decades to come. According to the official fire investigation report, the blaze started in the basement around midnight, likely due to a malfunction in the aging coal furnace that heated the old house. The fire spread with unusual speed and intensity, racing through the wooden framework and consuming the structure so rapidly that the family barely had time to escape. Robert Miller, the 45-year-old patriarch of the family, managed to get his wife and 3 children out through a second-floor window. But when he realized that his elderly father was still trapped in a downstairs bedroom, he made the fatal decision to go back inside. Neighbors who witnessed the fire described seeing Robert Miller disappear into the smoke and flames that were already consuming the first floor of the house. They waited in horror for him to emerge with his father, but neither man ever appeared. The house collapsed within minutes of Miller's re-entry, trapping both men in an inferno so intense that it took firefighters from 3 counties working through the night to finally extinguish the blaze. When the ashes cooled enough for investigators to search the ruins, they found the remains of Miller's father in his bedroom. But Robert Miller's body was never recovered. The mystery of Robert Miller's missing remains haunted his family and the local community for months. Investigators conducted multiple searches of the fire debris, sifting through every ash pile and examining every piece of twisted metal. But they found no trace of the man who had disappeared into the flames. Some speculated that the fire had been so intense that his body had been completely consumed, reduced to ash so fine that it had blown away in the wind. Others wondered if Miller had somehow escaped the house but died elsewhere. Though extensive searches of the surrounding area revealed no evidence to support this theory. The first sighting of the scorched man occurred less than 6 months after the Miller House fire, along a stretch of Highway 80 that wound through the mountains about 5 miles from where the tragedy had occurred. A local trucker named Danny Osborne was driving his rig through the area around 2 a.m. when he noticed a figure walking along the shoulder of the road. The man appeared to be in distress, stumbling rather than walking normally, and Osborne could see that his clothes were smoking in the cool night air. Thinking he had encountered someone who had been in a recent accident or fire, Osborne pulled over to offer assistance. As his headlights illuminated the figure more clearly, Osborne was horrified to see that the man's face and hands were covered with what appeared to be fresh burns, the kind of injuries that would require immediate medical attention. The man's clothes were charred and still smoldering, as if he had just escaped from a fire, and there was a strong smell of smoke and burned flesh in the air. Most disturbing of all, the man seemed unaware of his injuries, walking with the mechanical gait of someone in severe shock. Osborne called out to the burned man, offering to drive him to the nearest hospital, but the figure didn't respond to his voice. Instead, the man continued walking along the roadside, moving with purpose despite his obvious injuries. When Osborne got out of his truck and approached on foot, he was shocked to realize that the burned man looked familiar. The facial features, despite the terrible damage, matched those of Robert Miller, the man who had died in the house fire months earlier. As this recognition dawned on Osborne, the figure suddenly stopped walking and turned to face him directly. The burned man's eyes were completely vacant, showing no sign of recognition or awareness, but his mouth moved as if he was trying to speak. No sound emerged, but Osborne could see that the man was mouthing the same words over and over again, though the trucker couldn't make out what he was trying to say. The encounter lasted only a few minutes before the figure began to fade, becoming increasingly transparent until it disappeared entirely, leaving only the lingering smell of smoke in the night air. Osborne's account of the encounter spread quickly through the tight-knit mountain community, and within weeks, other drivers were reporting similar sightings along the same stretch of highway. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. A burned man walking along the roadside, always alone, always appearing to be in distress, and always disappearing when witnesses tried to approach or help. Most disturbing of all, several witnesses independently identified the figure as resembling Robert Miller, though they couldn't explain how a dead man could be walking along a mountain highway. As reports of the scorched man accumulated over the following years, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The apparition didn't appear randomly. His sightings seemed to coincide with house fires in the surrounding counties. Local firefighters and emergency responders began to notice that whenever the scorched man was spotted, they could expect to receive calls about structure fires within 24 to 48 hours. The connection was so consistent that some fire departments began treating scorched man sightings as unofficial early warning systems for potential fire emergencies. The most documented case of this supernatural fire prediction occurred in the summer of 1987, when multiple witnesses reported seeing the scorched man walking along Highway 80 on 3 consecutive nights. Emergency responders who were familiar with the pattern began preparing for an unusually active fire period, and their preparations proved prophetic. Over the following week, 6 different house fires broke out across 3 counties, an unprecedented cluster of structural fires that stretched emergency resources to their limits. All 6 fires occurred in older homes with aging heating systems or electrical problems, and investigators noted that the fires shared several characteristics with the original Miller house blaze. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery that, in each case, the scorched man had been spotted walking along roads that provided the most direct route between the fire locations. Investigators who mapped his sightings found that the spirit appeared to be following a specific path that connected the sites of past and future fires, as if he was somehow drawn to locations where tragedy was about to occur. This realization transformed the scorched man from a simple ghost story into something far more unsettling. A supernatural herald of disaster whose appearances served as warnings of impending tragedy. The psychological impact of these patterns was profound for the communities affected by the phenomenon. Families living in older homes along the scorched man's route began experiencing anxiety whenever new sightings were reported, knowing that their properties might be at risk for fire in the coming days. Some residents invested in new smoke detectors, updated their electrical systems, or replaced aging heating equipment specifically because they feared being targeted by whatever force was driving the supernatural fire cycle. Local fire departments found themselves in the unusual position of having to develop protocols for responding to paranormal warnings. While they couldn't officially acknowledge the supernatural aspects of the phenomenon, many firefighters began paying extra attention to fire safety inspections and prevention activities whenever scorched man sightings were reported. Some departments even began conducting informal patrols of areas along the spirit's known routes, hoping to catch potential fires in their early stages. The most personal encounter with the scorched man was reported by Sarah Miller, Robert Miller's daughter, who had survived the original house fire as a teenager. In 1995, 12 years after losing her father and grandfather, Sarah was driving home from her job at a local hospital when she noticed a familiar figure walking along the roadside. Even after more than a decade, she immediately recognized her father's distinctive walk and posture, despite the terrible burns that covered his ghostly form. Unlike other witnesses who had been frightened by their encounters, Sarah felt compelled to stop and try to communicate with her father's spirit. She pulled her car over and approached the figure on foot, calling out to him by name and trying to get his attention. For the first time in any documented encounter, the scorched man responded to a witness, turning towards Sarah with an expression of recognition in his burned features. According to Sarah's account, her father's ghost tried to speak to her, but his voice came out as nothing more than a whisper that sounded like wind through dry leaves. She could see that he was trying desperately to communicate something important. His burned hands gesturing frantically, as if warning her about some imminent danger. The encounter lasted nearly 10 minutes, during which Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of love and protection emanating from the spirit, despite his terrifying appearance. The message became clear 2 days later, when a fire broke out in Sarah's apartment building, caused by faulty wiring that had been smoldering in the walls for weeks. Because of her encounter with her father's ghost, Sarah had been hypervigilant about fire safety, and she detected the smell of smoke early enough to evacuate the building and alert firefighters before the blaze could spread. The fire department later determined that without the early warning, the fire could have trapped residents in their sleep and resulted in multiple fatalities. Modern investigators who have studied the scorched man phenomenon have noted several unique characteristics that distinguish it from typical ghost sightings. The spirit appears to retain some form of supernatural awareness about fire-related dangers, suggesting that Robert Miller's consciousness remains connected to the circumstances of his death in ways that allow him to perceive and warn about similar threats. This protective aspect of the haunting has led some researchers to theorize that Miller's spirit is driven by a desire to prevent other families from experiencing the tragedy that befell his own. The consistency of the scorched man's appearance has also puzzled investigators. Unlike many spirits whose manifestations vary depending on the witness or circumstances, Miller's ghost always appears exactly as he would have looked moments after being consumed by fire. Burned, smoking, and clearly suffering from fatal injuries. This suggests that the spirit is somehow locked in the moment of his death, forever experiencing the agony of burning while simultaneously trying to protect others from the same fate. Today, the scorched man continues to appear along the mountain highways of eastern Kentucky, his presence serving as both a supernatural curiosity and a practical warning system for local emergency responders. While skeptics dismiss the phenomenon as coincidence or mass hysteria, the families who have been warned by his appearances know better. For them, Robert Miller's ghost represents something profound about the bonds that tie us to the places and people we love. Connections so strong that not even death by fire can completely sever them. The legacy of the scorched man extends beyond simple ghost lore to touch on fundamental questions about sacrifice, protection, and the persistence of love beyond death. Robert Miller died trying to save his father from a house fire, and his spirit appears to continue that protective mission decades after his death, warning others about fire dangers that he somehow perceives through supernatural means. His story suggests that some forms of heroism are so pure that they create spiritual imprints capable of continuing their protective work even after the hero's physical death, turning tragedy into a form of eternal vigilance that serves the living long after the dead have departed. The Appalachian Trail has always been a place where hikers expect to face natural challenges, steep climbs, unpredictable weather, and the occasional encounter with wildlife. But what happened to Jessica Chen and her hiking partner Mark Rodriguez on a remote section of trail in southwestern Virginia? In the summer of 2019, proved that sometimes the greatest dangers in the mountains aren't natural at all. Their experience revealed that there are predators in the Appalachian wilderness who hunt not for food or territory, but for the simple pleasure of causing pain and terror to those who dare to venture into their domain. Jessica and Mark were experienced hikers who had been planning their week-long section hike through the Mount Rogers National Recreation Area for months. Both were seasoned outdoors enthusiasts who had completed numerous challenging trails throughout the eastern United States. They carried proper equipment, had filed detailed itineraries with park services, and possessed the kind of wilderness experience that should have prepared them for any reasonable challenge the trail might present. But nothing in their years of hiking had prepared them for what they would encounter on the night of July 23rd, when their peaceful camping experience turned into a fight for survival against an unseen attacker who seemed to emerge from the darkness itself. The couple had made excellent time during their first 3 days on the trail, covering nearly 60 miles of challenging terrain while enjoying perfect weather and spectacular mountain views. They had encountered other hikers regularly during daylight hours, sharing trail information and camping recommendations with fellow backpackers who were tackling the same section of the Appalachian Trail. The atmosphere had been friendly and supportive, typical of the trail community that makes long-distance hiking such a rewarding social experience. On their fourth night, Jessica and Mark chose to camp at a dispersed camping area approximately 2 miles south of the Mount Rogers summit, in a location that offered both stunning views and reliable water access. The site was far enough from the main trail to provide privacy while still being accessible to other hikers in case of emergency. They followed all proper camping protocols, securing their food against bears, setting up their tent on durable surfaces, and ensuring their campfire was completely extinguished before retiring for the night. The attack began around 2 a.m., with sounds that Jessica later described as like someone walking through the forest, but trying not to be heard. The couple woke to the sound of branches breaking and leaves rustling in patterns that didn't match normal wildlife movement. Both experienced hikers. They immediately recognized that something was moving through the forest near their campsite. Something large enough to disturb the undergrowth, but attempting to move stealthily. Mark quietly unzipped their tent and peered outside, expecting to see a bear or deer that had wandered close to their campsite. Instead, he saw the beam of a flashlight moving through the trees about 50 yards away, sweeping back and forth as if someone was searching for something. The light was being used intermittently, turning on for a few seconds before disappearing again, suggesting that whoever was carrying it was trying to avoid detection while still being able to navigate the difficult terrain. The couple's first instinct was to call out to what they assumed was another hiker who might be lost or in distress. Night hiking wasn't uncommon on the Appalachian Trail, and experienced hikers often helped each other navigate difficult situations. But when Mark called out, "Hello, do you need help?" the flashlight immediately disappeared, and the forest fell into complete silence. The sudden cessation of sound was more unsettling than the original noise had been, creating an atmosphere of tension that made both hikers feel like they were being watched by someone who didn't want to be discovered. For the next hour, Jessica and Mark remained awake in their tent, listening for any sign of the mysterious presence that had been moving through the forest. They heard occasional sounds: the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the soft thud of footsteps on forest floor. But nothing that suggested the unknown visitor had moved away from their general area. Most disturbing of all, the sounds seemed to be coming from different directions, as if whoever was out there was circling their campsite, studying their position, and planning some kind of approach. The direct attack came without warning, around 3:30 a.m. Jessica was awakened by a sudden, sharp pain in her left leg, as if something had struck her through the tent fabric. Before she could react or call out, she felt another impact, this one harder and more focused, followed by an excruciating pain that told her immediately that her leg had been seriously injured. Mark was awakened by Jessica's scream of pain and the sound of something heavy striking the tent repeatedly. In the chaos that followed, both hikers realized they were under attack by someone wielding what felt like a baseball bat or similar weapon. The strikes were coming through the tent walls from multiple directions, suggesting that either there were multiple attackers or a single individual was moving around the tent with remarkable speed. The impacts were clearly targeted at their legs and lower bodies, as if the attacker was specifically trying to disable them rather than kill them outright. Mark managed to grab his headlamp and knife, while Jessica tried to protect herself from the continued strikes. When he turned on the light and unzipped the tent, he caught a brief glimpse of a figure dressed in dark clothing moving away from their campsite. The attacker appeared to be wearing some kind of face covering and carried what looked like a wooden club or bat. Most chilling of all, the figure seemed to move through the forest with an unnatural ease, disappearing into the darkness as if the difficult terrain posed no obstacle to their movement. The couple's immediate priority was assessing Jessica's injuries and determining whether they could defend themselves if the attack continued. Jessica's left leg was clearly broken, with severe pain and swelling that made standing impossible. Mark had sustained bruises and cuts from the strikes that had penetrated the tent fabric, but his injuries were not as severe. However, both hikers realized they were in an extremely vulnerable position. Miles from help, with limited cell phone coverage and facing an unknown attacker who might return at any moment. Mark made the decision to arm himself with his hiking knife and hatchet, while helping Jessica move to a more defensible position. They dragged their sleeping bags and essential gear away from the tent, which had been badly damaged by the attack, and found a location where they could put their backs against a large rock formation. This position would prevent anyone from approaching them from behind, while giving them a clear view of the surrounding forest. The psychological warfare that followed was almost as terrifying as the physical attack had been. For the remainder of the night, the couple could hear their attacker moving through the forest around them, sometimes close enough that they could hear breathing, and whispered words they couldn't quite make out. The presence seemed to be testing their defenses, moving closer and then retreating, creating a constant state of tension and fear that prevented them from relaxing their guard for even a moment. Most disturbing of all were the sounds of what appeared to be the attacker striking trees and rocks with the same weapon that had been used against them. The rhythmic thumping echoed through the forest like a primitive drum beat, creating an atmosphere of menace that suggested the attack had been motivated by something more than simple robbery or random violence. The pattern of sounds seemed almost ritualistic, as if the attacker was engaged in some kind of ceremony or celebration related to the assault. Dawn finally brought some relief, as the attacking presence seemed to withdraw with the arrival of daylight. But Jessica and Mark's ordeal was far from over. They were miles from the nearest road. Jessica's broken leg made hiking impossible, and their cell phones showed no signal in the remote location where they had chosen to camp. Mark faced the difficult decision of whether to leave Jessica alone while he hiked for help, or whether to try to signal for assistance from their current location. The solution came from an unexpected source. Around 8 a.m., they heard voices approaching from the direction of the main trail. A group of day hikers was passing through the area, and Mark's calls for help brought them to the couple's location. The day hikers were shocked by what they found: a destroyed campsite, 2 injured people, and clear evidence that some kind of violent assault had taken place in what should have been a safe wilderness area. One of the day hikers had a satellite communicator that allowed them to contact emergency services, while others provided first aid to Jessica and helped secure the area in case the attacker returned. The rescue operation that followed required helicopters and specialized mountain rescue teams, as Jessica's injuries made it impossible to evacuate her on foot. The complexity of the rescue highlighted just how isolated and vulnerable the couple had been during their night-long ordeal. The investigation that followed revealed disturbing details about the attack and raised troubling questions about safety on remote sections of the Appalachian Trail. Law enforcement officials found clear evidence at the campsite that supported Jessica and Mark's account: damaged tent fabric, footprints from someone wearing military-style boots, and marks on trees that matched the couple's description of the rhythmic striking sounds they had heard throughout the night. Most unsettling of all was the discovery that this wasn't an isolated incident. When investigators contacted trail maintenance organizations and park services, they learned that there had been several similar attacks on remote sections of the Appalachian Trail over the previous 5 years. In each case, hikers had been assaulted by unknown individuals who targeted their legs and lower bodies, as if the goal was to disable rather than kill. The attacks always occurred at night, in remote locations, and the perpetrators seemed to have intimate knowledge of the trail system and wilderness areas. The pattern suggested that there was either a single individual or a small group of people who were systematically targeting hikers in isolated areas, using their knowledge of the trail system to select victims who would be vulnerable and far from help. The focus on leg injuries seemed designed to prevent victims from escaping or pursuing their attackers, while the nighttime timing and remote locations made it extremely difficult for law enforcement to investigate or prevent future attacks. For Jessica and Mark, the physical recovery from their ordeal was complicated by the psychological trauma of the experience. Jessica required surgery to repair her broken leg and months of physical therapy to regain full mobility, but both hikers struggled with the emotional impact of having their love of wilderness hiking transformed into a source of fear and anxiety. The attack had violated their sense of safety in the natural world and left them questioning whether they could ever again feel secure camping in remote areas. The couple's experience also highlighted the vulnerabilities that face hikers on remote sections of the Appalachian Trail. Despite their experience, proper equipment, and reasonable precautions, they had been completely unprepared for a deliberate human attack. The incident raised questions about whether traditional wilderness safety protocols were adequate for dealing with predatory humans who specifically targeted hikers for violence. Today, Jessica and Mark continue to hike, but their approach to wilderness camping has been fundamentally changed by their experience. They now carry satellite communicators, defensive weapons, and always camp in groups when possible. Their story has become part of a growing awareness within the hiking community that the Appalachian Trail, despite its reputation as a safe and welcoming environment, can harbor dangers that go far beyond the natural challenges that most hikers prepare for. The identity of their attacker remains unknown, and law enforcement agencies continue to investigate similar incidents throughout the Appalachian region. The pattern of attack suggests that somewhere in the mountains, there are individuals who view hikers not as fellow outdoor enthusiasts, but as prey to be hunted and terrorized. For those who venture into the remote sections of the Appalachian Trail, the knowledge that such predators exist adds a new dimension of risk to an activity that should represent escape from the dangers of civilized society. The case serves as a stark reminder that while the Appalachian Mountains are filled with natural beauty and spiritual renewal, they also contain human monsters who use the wilderness as their hunting ground. For Jessica and Mark, their week-long hiking adventure became a night of terror that changed their relationship with the outdoors forever, proving that sometimes the most dangerous predators in the mountains are the ones that walk on two legs and carry weapons designed not to kill quickly, but to cause maximum suffering and fear. In the dense forests of southwestern Virginia, where the Appalachian Mountains create a labyrinth of ridges, valleys, and forgotten hollows, there exists a stretch of wilderness that locals avoid after dark. It's not marked on any maps as dangerous, and park services don't post warnings about unusual risks in the area. But for those who live in the scattered communities along the mountain's edge, everyone knows the unspoken rule. If you must travel through the Grayson Highlands after sunset, never go alone and never stay longer than necessary. This is the story of David and Maria Santos, a couple whose romantic weekend backpacking trip turned into a 3-day nightmare of being hunted by something that moved through the forest with inhuman patience and seemed to understand their every move before they made it. David and Maria had been planning their anniversary backpacking trip for months, carefully selecting a remote section of the Appalachian Trail that would give them the solitude and natural beauty they craved after a stressful year in their respective careers. Both were experienced hikers who had completed numerous challenging trails throughout the mid-Atlantic region, and they possessed the kind of wilderness skills that came from years of weekend adventures and outdoor education courses. They carried quality gear, maintained detailed trip plans, and followed all the safety protocols that experienced backpackers consider essential for wilderness travel. The couple began their hike on a Thursday morning in late September, when the autumn foliage was approaching peak color and the weather forecast promised 3 days of perfect hiking conditions. Their planned route would take them through some of the most spectacular and isolated terrain in Virginia, following ridgelines that offered panoramic views while keeping them far from the crowds that gathered at more accessible destinations. For the first day and a half, everything went exactly according to plan. They made good time, enjoyed incredible scenery, and felt the deep satisfaction that comes from being completely self-sufficient in a beautiful wilderness setting. The first sign that something was wrong came on Friday evening, as they were setting up camp in a meadow approximately 8 miles from the nearest road. David was securing their tent, while Maria filtered water from a nearby stream when she noticed movement in the tree line about 100 yards away. At first, she assumed it was a deer or other wildlife, but as she watched more carefully, she realized that whatever was moving through the forest was doing so in a distinctly unnatural way. The movement was too deliberate, too coordinated, and too focused on their campsite to be attributed to normal animal behavior. When Maria pointed out the disturbance to David, he grabbed binoculars and tried to get a better look at whatever was moving through the trees. What he saw made his blood run cold. There were at least 3 figures positioned at different points along the tree line, all of them motionless now that they had been observed, but clearly watching the couple's every move. The figures were partially concealed by vegetation, making it impossible to make out details about their appearance or intentions. But their positioning suggested a level of coordination that was deeply unsettling. David's first instinct was to call out to the watchers, thinking they might be other hikers who were lost or in need of assistance. But when he shouted, "Hello, do you need help?" across the meadow, the figures immediately melted back into the forest, disappearing so quickly and quietly that it seemed impossible for humans to move with such stealth through the dense undergrowth. The couple waited for several minutes, scanning the tree line for any sign of the mysterious watchers, but saw nothing that suggested anyone was still observing them. Despite the unsettling encounter, David and Maria decided to continue with their planned camping arrangements, reasoning that they had probably encountered other hikers who were simply being cautious about approaching strangers in a remote location. They took extra precautions with their campsite security, hung their food at a considerable distance from their tent, and made sure their headlamps and other safety equipment were easily accessible. But as darkness fell over the mountain meadow, both hikers found themselves unable to shake the feeling that they were still being watched by unseen eyes. The psychological warfare began around midnight, when the couple was awakened by sounds that suggested someone was moving around the perimeter of their campsite. Unlike the random noise that wildlife might make, these sounds followed deliberate patterns, footsteps that circled their tent at a consistent distance, the snap of twigs that seemed to come from multiple directions, and occasional sounds that resembled whispered conversations just beyond the range of clear hearing. Most disturbing of all, the sounds seemed to be getting closer to their tent with each circuit, as if their unseen visitors were gradually tightening the circle around their position. David armed himself with his knife and headlamp, preparing to confront whoever was harassing them. But every time he unzipped the tent and shined his light toward the source of the sounds, the forest fell into complete silence. The sudden cessation of noise was more unnerving than the original sounds had been, creating an atmosphere of tension that made it impossible for either hiker to relax. They spent the entire night taking turns keeping watch, but never caught sight of whoever was responsible for the nocturnal disturbances. Dawn brought temporary relief, but it also revealed evidence that their nighttime fears had been justified. Around their campsite, They found multiple sets of footprints in the soft earth near the stream, prints that clearly belonged to several different individuals who'd been moving around their camp during the night. Most disturbing of all, some of the prints were found within 10 feet of their tent, suggesting that their watchers had approached much closer than the sounds had indicated. The realization that unknown individuals had been able to move so close to them without being detected left both hikers feeling vulnerable and exposed. The discovery of the footprints forced David and Maria to confront the reality that they were being deliberately stalked by multiple individuals who possessed advanced wilderness skills and seemed to have malicious intentions. The couple faced a difficult decision. They could abandon their backpacking trip and hike out immediately, or they could continue with their planned route while taking extra precautions against further harassment. After extensive discussion, they decided to continue hiking but to modify their route to avoid the most isolated sections of trail, and to camp only in areas that offered better defensive positions. The second day of hiking revealed that their stalkers had not been discouraged by the morning's discovery. Throughout the day, David and Maria caught occasional glimpses of figures moving parallel to their route, always staying far enough away to avoid clear identification, but close enough to make their presence known. The watchers seemed to have an uncanny knowledge of the terrain, using ridgelines and tree cover to maintain observation of the couple, while remaining largely invisible themselves. Most unsettling of all, the stalkers appeared to be anticipating the couple's movements, sometimes positioning themselves along the trail ahead of where David and Maria were hiking. By afternoon, the psychological pressure of being constantly observed was taking its toll on both hikers. Every rustle in the forest, every shadow that seemed out of place, every sound that didn't have an obvious natural explanation became a source of anxiety and fear. The couple found themselves hiking faster than was comfortable, driven by an urgent desire to reach their planned campsite before dark and establish some kind of defensive position for the coming night. Their second night's campsite was chosen specifically for its defensive advantages. A small clearing surrounded by thick vegetation that would make it difficult for anyone to approach without making noise, with a steep rock face at one end that would prevent encirclement. David and Maria set up their camp with military precision, creating clear sight lines in all directions and positioning their gear for quick access to defensive tools. They also made the decision to maintain a continuous watch throughout the night, with one person always awake and alert, while the other attempted to rest. The second night's harassment was more intense and more organized than the first night's had been. The watchers seemed to have studied the couple's defensive preparations and adapted their tactics accordingly. Instead of simply circling the campsite, they began employing more sophisticated psychological warfare techniques. The stalkers would create sounds that mimicked distress calls, trying to lure one or both hikers away from their defensive position. They threw rocks and sticks toward the campsite from different directions, creating the impression of multiple coordinated attacks that never quite materialized into direct confrontation. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that their stalkers were using some form of artificial light to conduct their nighttime surveillance. David and Maria began noticing brief flashes of what appeared to be infrared illumination coming from the forest around their campsite. Flashes that were visible only peripherally and disappeared the moment they tried to look directly at them. The realization that their watchers possessed night vision technology transformed the situation from a wilderness harassment case into something that suggested military or law enforcement training. The third day brought the terrifying realization that their stalkers had no intention of letting them leave the area safely. When David and Maria broke camp and began hiking toward the trailhead where their car was parked, they discovered that their route was being systematically blocked by their pursuers. Every time they tried to take a direct path toward civilization, They would encounter evidence that someone was waiting ahead of them. Footprints across the trail, disturbed vegetation that suggested recent human passage, and in one case, a small pile of rocks that had been deliberately arranged to send a clear message that their movements were being monitored and controlled. The couple was forced to take increasingly circuitous routes as they tried to evade their stalkers and reach safety. Each detour added miles to their journey and took them further into remote terrain, where help would be even more difficult to reach. The psychological pressure of being herded like animals through the wilderness was devastating, creating a level of fear and helplessness that neither hiker had ever experienced before. The climax of their ordeal came on the third night, when David and Maria realized they were completely surrounded by their stalkers, and that escape was no longer possible through stealth or evasion. The couple made the decision to abandon their camping gear and make a desperate nighttime march toward the nearest road, using their headlamps and GPS to navigate in the darkness while their pursuers closed in around them. The 6-hour forced march through treacherous terrain in complete darkness, while being constantly harassed by unseen watchers, pushed both hikers to the limits of their physical and psychological endurance. The nightmare finally ended when David and Maria reached a Forest Service road around dawn and encountered a maintenance crew that was beginning their daily rounds. The couple's appearance, disheveled, exhausted, and clearly terrified, immediately convinced the workers that they had experienced some kind of serious emergency. When David and Maria explained that they had been stalked and harassed for 3 days by unknown individuals, the maintenance crew contacted law enforcement and provided the couple with transportation to safety. The investigation that followed revealed disturbing details about the couple's experience and raised troubling questions about organized criminal activity in remote wilderness areas. Forest Service law enforcement officers found extensive evidence at the couple's abandoned campsites that supported their account of being systematically stalked. The investigators discovered multiple observation posts that had been constructed in the forest around the couple's camping areas, posts that showed signs of having been occupied for extended periods and equipped with sophisticated surveillance equipment. Most chilling of all was the discovery that David and Maria's experience was not unique. When investigators contacted other law enforcement agencies in the region, they learned that there had been several similar incidents over the previous 2 years involving hikers who had been stalked and harassed in remote wilderness areas. In each case, the victims described being watched and followed by multiple individuals who seemed to possess advanced wilderness and surveillance skills. The pattern suggested the existence of an organized group that was specifically targeting hikers for reasons that remained unclear. The investigation also revealed that the stalkers had been using military-grade equipment, including night vision devices, infrared cameras, and communication systems that allowed them to coordinate their activities across large areas of wilderness. The level of sophistication and organization suggested that the group responsible for the harassment possessed either military or law enforcement training and had access to equipment that was not readily available to civilian criminals. For David and Maria, the physical recovery from their ordeal was complicated by the lasting psychological trauma of having been hunted like animals through the wilderness they had always considered a place of refuge and renewal. Both hikers required counseling to deal with the anxiety and hypervigilance that followed their experience, and their relationship with wilderness hiking was fundamentally changed by the knowledge that human predators could turn even the most remote natural areas into hunting grounds. Today, the couple continues to hike, but never alone and never in remote areas where help would be more than a few hours away. Their story has become part of a growing awareness within the hiking community that the wilderness, despite its reputation as an escape from human dangers, can harbor threats that are far more sophisticated and organized than most outdoor enthusiasts realize. For those who venture into the remote sections of the Appalachian Mountains, the knowledge that organized groups of stalkers may be operating in the area adds a new dimension of risk to activities that should represent freedom from the dangers of civilized society. The identity of the group responsible for stalking David and Maria remains unknown, and law enforcement agencies continue to investigate similar incidents throughout the Appalachian region. The systematic nature of the harassment and the sophisticated equipment used suggest that somewhere in the mountains, there are individuals or organizations that view hikers not as fellow outdoor enthusiasts, but as targets for psychological warfare and territorial control. The realization that such predators exist has fundamentally changed how many people approach wilderness recreation, transforming solitary hiking from a peaceful pursuit into a potentially dangerous activity that requires military-level situational awareness and defensive preparation. There's an unwritten rule among the people who live in the remote hollows of West Virginia's Appalachian Mountains. If you hear your name called from the forest, especially at night, you don't answer. You don't investigate. You don't even acknowledge that you heard it. This rule isn't based on superstition or old wives' tales. It's born from generations of experience with something that lurks in the deep woods, something that has learned to perfectly mimic human voices and uses this ability to lure people away from safety and into the darkness where they are never seen again. For Sarah Mitchell, a wildlife biologist who had recently moved to the area to study the region's black bear population, this mountain wisdom seemed like quaint folklore until the night she experienced it firsthand. Mitchell had relocated from urban Maryland to a remote research station in the Monongahela National Forest, where she was conducting a multi-year study on bear behavior and habitat usage. Her work required her to spend long hours alone in the wilderness, monitoring trail cameras, collecting data, and tracking radio-collared bears through some of the most isolated terrain in the eastern United States. Mitchell's research station was a converted Forest Service cabin located 15 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a winding dirt road that became impassable during heavy weather. The isolation was exactly what she needed for her research, providing access to pristine bear habitat while eliminating the human disturbances that could affect her study subjects' natural behavior. For the first 6 months of her residency, Mitchell thrived in the solitude, finding peace in the natural rhythms of the forest and satisfaction in the important conservation work she was conducting. The phenomenon that would shatter her sense of security began in October, during the period when bears were actively foraging in preparation for winter hibernation. Mitchell was working late in her cabin, analyzing data from her trail cameras, when she heard someone calling her name from the forest outside. The voice was clear and distinct, definitely human, and it seemed to be coming from the direction of the main trail that connected her research station to the nearest Forest Service road. Mitchell's first assumption was that another researcher or Forest Service employee had arrived to check on her work, though it was unusual for anyone to visit after dark without prior arrangements. She grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the cabin's porch, calling out, "Hello, who's there?" in response to the voice. But instead of receiving an answer from a colleague or visitor, she heard her name called again, this time from a completely different direction, as if whoever was in the forest had moved several hundred yards in the few seconds since the first call. Thinking that she might be dealing with someone who was lost or in distress, Mitchell called out again, offering assistance and asking if the person needed help. The response was her name being called from a third location, then a fourth, as if multiple people were positioned throughout the forest around her cabin. But there was something unsettling about the calls. They all sounded like the same voice, speaking with identical intonation and cadence, as if the same person was somehow calling from multiple locations simultaneously. As Mitchell stood on her porch trying to make sense of what she was hearing, she noticed that her 2 dogs, both German shepherds who normally investigated any unusual sounds around the property, were cowering inside the cabin with their tails between their legs. The dogs' behavior was completely out of character. They were trained protection animals who had never shown fear of wildlife or human visitors. Their obvious terror at something they could hear or smell in the forest sent a chill through Mitchell that had nothing to do with the October night air. The calling continued for nearly an hour, with Mitchell's name being spoken from locations that formed a rough circle around her cabin. The voice never got closer than what she estimated to be about 100 yards, but it also never moved farther away, as if whatever was calling her name was maintaining a specific distance while slowly orbiting her property. Most disturbing of all, the voice was beginning to sound increasingly familiar, though Mitchell couldn't place where she might have heard it before. When the calling finally stopped, the silence that followed was almost more unnerving than the voices had been. The normal night sounds of the forest, owls, insects, small animals moving through the underbrush, had completely disappeared, creating an unnatural quiet that suggested every living creature in the area was hiding from something they recognized as dangerous. Mitchell remained on her porch for another hour, listening for any sign of the mysterious caller, but heard nothing that indicated anyone was still in the area. The next morning revealed evidence that Mitchell's experience had not been a dream or hallucination. Around her cabin, she found multiple sets of footprints in the soft earth, prints that appeared to have been made by someone walking in large circles around her property. But the prints were strange. They were human-sized and shaped, but they seemed to have been made by feet that were unnaturally wide and lacked the distinct heel and toe impressions that normal shoes or boots would leave. More disturbing still, some of the prints appeared to have claw marks at the toe end, as if whatever had been walking around her cabin possessed both human intelligence and animal physical characteristics. Mitchell documented the prints with photographs and measurements, thinking they might represent evidence of an unknown species or possibly tracks left by someone wearing unusual footwear. But when she contacted local wildlife officials and law enforcement about her experience, their reactions were more concerned than curious. Instead of showing scientific interest in the strange tracks, the officials warned Mitchell about the dangers of responding to voices calling from the forest and urged her to consider relocating her research to a less isolated location. The warnings became more urgent when Mitchell described the voice's increasing familiarity to local residents who had lived in the area for generations. According to their accounts, the entity that called people's names from the forest had the ability to mimic voices perfectly, often sounding like deceased family members, lost friends, or loved ones who were far away. The creature seemed to study its intended victims, learning their speech patterns and emotional associations before using this knowledge to create calls that were almost impossible to resist answering. Despite the warnings, Mitchell decided to continue her research, reasoning that her work was too important to abandon based on what might be elaborate pranks or misidentified wildlife encounters. She installed motion-activated lights around her cabin, upgraded her security system, and made arrangements for more frequent check-ins with her supervisors. But she also began keeping detailed records of any unusual auditory phenomena, hoping to document whatever was responsible for the mysterious calls and perhaps contribute to a scientific understanding of the phenomenon. The creature's tactics evolved over the following weeks, demonstrating an intelligence and adaptability that was deeply unsettling. Instead of simply calling Mitchell's name from the forest, the entity began using the voices of people from her past. Her deceased grandmother, her ex-husband who lived in another state, and even her research supervisor who was currently working in Alaska. Each voice was perfectly reproduced, complete with speech patterns, accent, and emotional inflections that would have been impossible for a stranger to replicate. The psychological impact of hearing these familiar voices calling from the darkness was devastating. Mitchell found herself torn between her rational understanding that she was being manipulated by some unknown entity and her emotional response to voices that sounded exactly like people she loved and missed. The creatures seemed to understand her vulnerabilities perfectly, using her grandmother's voice when Mitchell was feeling homesick and her supervisor's voice when she was struggling with difficult aspects of her research. The most terrifying incident occurred in November, when Mitchell was awakened at 3 a.m. by the sound of her own voice calling from outside the cabin. The entity had somehow learned to mimic her perfectly, and she could hear herself calling out for help in tones of increasing desperation and fear. The psychological horror of hearing her own voice begging for assistance while she lay terrified in her bed was unlike anything she had ever experienced, creating a level of disorientation and fear that left her questioning her own sanity. But it was the creature's interaction with technology that convinced Mitchell she was dealing with something far more dangerous than a skilled human mimic. Her trail cameras, which were positioned throughout the forest to monitor bear activity, began capturing strange images of a figure that appeared to be human from a distance, but showed disturbing anomalies when viewed closely. The figure's proportions seemed wrong. Arms that were too long, a torso that was too narrow, and a head that sat at an unnatural angle on its shoulders. Most disturbing of all were the recordings from her audio monitoring equipment, which was designed to capture bear vocalizations. The devices recorded not only the creature's voice mimicry, but also sounds that preceded and followed the calls. Clicking noises that resembled insect communication, low-frequency rumbles that were felt more than heard, and what sounded like multiple voices whispering in languages that didn't match any human speech patterns Mitchell had ever encountered. The climax of Mitchell's ordeal came when the creature began using her own recorded voice to call her name, playing back conversations she had had with family members during phone calls made from her cabin. The realization that the entity had somehow been listening to and recording her private conversations was a violation that went beyond simple harassment into something that felt like psychological warfare designed to drive her from the area or into complete madness. The final straw came when Mitchell's dogs, who had been her constant companions and protectors throughout the ordeal, began responding to the creature's calls as if they recognized the voices as legitimate. She watched in horror as her highly trained protection animals whined and scratched at the door when they heard the mimicked voices of people they had never met but somehow seemed to recognize. The creature's ability to manipulate even her dogs suggested a level of supernatural or technological capability that was far beyond anything Mitchell felt equipped to handle alone. Mitchell made the difficult decision to abandon her research and relocate to a different study area after documenting her experiences in a detailed report that she submitted to wildlife authorities and paranormal research organizations. Her account joined dozens of similar reports from the Appalachian region, all describing encounters with an entity that used voice mimicry to lure people away from safety and into the forest, where they disappeared without a trace. Today, Mitchell continues her bear research in a different part of the country, but she has never forgotten the lessons learned during her time in the West Virginia mountains. She has become an advocate for educating researchers and outdoor enthusiasts about the dangers of responding to unexplained voices in remote wilderness areas. And her detailed documentation has contributed to a growing body of evidence suggesting that the Appalachian Mountains harbor entities that pose serious threats to human safety. The identity and nature of the mimicking entity remains unknown, but the consistency of reports across multiple states and decades suggests that something with advanced vocal capabilities is actively hunting humans in the remote forests of Appalachia. For those who work or recreate in these areas, Mitchell's experience serves as a crucial reminder that the ancient wisdom of mountain communities should not be dismissed as mere superstition. When the forest calls your name, the safest response is to ignore it completely, no matter how familiar or desperate the voice might sound. The creature that mimics human voices represents one of the most psychologically sophisticated threats in the Appalachian wilderness, using our deepest emotional connections against us and turning the voices of our loved ones into weapons of terror and manipulation. Mitchell's story demonstrates that even trained scientists with advanced equipment and extensive outdoor experience can become victims of entities that understand human psychology better than we understand them. And her escape serves as both a warning and a testament to the importance of recognizing when retreat is the only viable option for survival. In the remote coal mining regions of eastern Kentucky, where abandoned mine shafts pierce the mountains like wounds that never heal, there are family secrets so dark that they're passed down through generations in whispered conversations and coded warnings. This is the story of a revelation that came too late, a confession that explained decades of nightmares, and the terrible truth about what happened to a father who walked into the darkness of an abandoned mine and was never seen again. But sometimes the most horrifying discoveries aren't about supernatural entities or ancient curses. Sometimes they're about the monsters that live within our own families, and the lengths people will go to protect secrets that should have been buried forever. The Watson family had lived in the coal country of eastern Kentucky for 4 generations, their lives intertwined with the rhythms of mining that had shaped the region's culture and economy for over a century. Like many mining families, they had experienced their share of tragedy. Cave-ins, explosions, and the slow death of black lung disease had claimed relatives and neighbors with depressing regularity. But nothing in the family's history of mining-related losses had prepared them for the mystery that began on a cold December morning in 1987. When Robert Watson left his house to check on some equipment in the abandoned Black Rock mine and simply vanished without a trace, Robert Watson was a 42-year-old maintenance supervisor who had worked in the coal mines since he was 18 years old. He was known throughout the community as a reliable, hard-working man who took his responsibilities to his family and his job with equal seriousness. Robert had a wife, Margaret, and 3 children, 2 teenage daughters and a 10-year-old son named Tommy, who idolized his father and dreamed of following him into the mining business when he came of age. The family lived in a modest house on the outskirts of Hazard, close enough to the active mining operations that the sound of heavy machinery was a constant background presence in their daily lives. The Black Rock mine had been closed for nearly 5 years by the time Robert Watson disappeared, shut down when the coal seam played out, and the company decided it was no longer profitable to maintain operations. But like many abandoned mines in the region, Black Rock still contained valuable equipment and materials that required periodic monitoring and maintenance. Robert's job involved checking on this abandoned equipment, ensuring that copper wiring and other valuable materials weren't being stolen by scavengers, and monitoring the mine's structural integrity to prevent collapses that could affect nearby active operations. On the morning of December 15th, Robert left his house before dawn to conduct a routine inspection of the Black Rock mine's surface facilities. He told his wife he expected to be gone for most of the day, as he planned to inventory the remaining equipment and check on reports that someone had been seen near the mine entrance during the previous week. Robert was carrying his usual work gear: flashlights, safety equipment, and a radio that would allow him to communicate with the mining company's dispatch office if he encountered any problems. When Robert failed to return home that evening, Margaret Watson initially wasn't worried. Her husband's work often kept him out later than planned, especially when he was dealing with equipment problems or security issues at the abandoned sites. But when Robert didn't come home by midnight and hadn't responded to any of her phone calls, Margaret knew something was seriously wrong. She contacted the mining company's emergency line and learned that Robert had never checked in with dispatch as scheduled, and that his radio had been silent since early morning. The search for Robert Watson began at dawn the following day and quickly grew into one of the largest rescue operations in the region's history. Mining company personnel, local law enforcement, volunteer fire departments, and specialized mine rescue teams all participated in the effort to locate the missing man. The searchers focused their efforts on the Black Rock mine itself, reasoning that Robert had most likely encountered some kind of accident while conducting his inspection of the underground facilities. What the search teams found at the Black Rock mine was deeply unsettling. Robert's truck was parked at the mine entrance, exactly where it should have been, with his lunch and thermos still sitting on the front seat, as if he had just stepped away for a few minutes. His safety gear was missing from the truck, suggesting that he had equipped himself properly before entering the mine. Most puzzling of all, the mine's entrance showed clear signs that someone had recently gone inside. Fresh footprints in the coal dust, disturbances in the safety barriers that blocked unauthorized access, and evidence that someone had been using artificial lighting to navigate the dark tunnels. The underground search revealed that Robert had penetrated deep into the mine's tunnel system, far beyond the areas where routine maintenance would normally take him. The search teams followed his footprints and other signs of passage through nearly 2 miles of abandoned tunnels, chambers, and vertical shafts. But approximately 2 miles from the entrance, in a section of the mine that had been abandoned even before the facility's official closure, Robert Watson's trail simply ended. There were no signs of a cave-in, no evidence of an accident, and no indication of where he might have gone after reaching that point. The search continued for weeks, with teams exploring every accessible tunnel, shaft, and chamber in the vast underground complex. They found abandoned mining equipment, pools of stagnant water, and evidence of the wildlife that had moved into the mine since its closure. But they found no trace of Robert Watson beyond the point where his trail had mysteriously ended. Eventually, the official search was suspended, though family members and volunteers continued looking for any sign of the missing man well into the following spring. For the Watson family, Robert's disappearance created a wound that never fully healed. Margaret was left to raise 3 children alone, while dealing with the financial hardship of losing the family's primary income. The children struggled with the uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to their father, whether he was dead or alive, whether he had abandoned them voluntarily or been the victim of some terrible accident. Tommy Watson, who had been only 10 years old when his father disappeared, grew up haunted by questions that had no answers and dreams of somehow finding his father in the dark tunnels beneath the mountains. As years passed, the mystery of Robert Watson's disappearance became part of local folklore, discussed in the same conversations that covered mining accidents, family tragedies, and other losses that had shaped the community's collective memory. Various theories emerged to explain what might have happened. Some suggested that Robert had fallen into one of the mine's deep, water-filled shafts and drowned, while others believed he had suffered a medical emergency in a remote section of the mine, where his body would never be found. A few people whispered darker possibilities, suggesting that Robert might have encountered something in the depths of the mine that was better left undiscovered. The truth about Robert Watson's fate remained hidden for 35 years, buried beneath layers of family loyalty, community silence, and the kind of secrets that mining families learned to keep when survival depended on not asking too many questions about what happened in the darkness underground. But in 2022, as Tommy Watson was preparing for his own retirement after a career in mining that had been shaped by his father's mysterious disappearance, he received a phone call that would finally provide answers to the questions that had haunted him for most of his life. The call came from his Uncle Lee, Robert's younger brother, who was dying of lung cancer and had decided that some secrets were too heavy to carry to the grave. In a voice weakened by disease, but strengthened by the relief of finally telling the truth, Lee Watson confessed to a crime that had been eating away at his conscience for over 3 decades. The story he told was more horrifying than any of the theories that had circulated about Robert's disappearance, because it revealed that the greatest danger in the abandoned mine hadn't been structural collapse or industrial accidents. It had been the presence of a family member who was willing to commit murder to protect a secret that he believed was worth killing for. According to Lee's confession, Robert Watson had discovered something during his inspection of the Black Rock mine that his brother couldn't allow him to report to authorities. For several months prior to Robert's disappearance, Lee had been using the abandoned mine as a storage facility for stolen mining equipment and materials that he was selling on the black market. The operation involved several other miners and had generated substantial profits for the participants. But it also represented serious federal crimes that could have resulted in lengthy prison sentences for everyone involved. When Robert discovered evidence of the theft operation during his routine inspection, Lee knew that his brother's sense of duty and honesty would compel him to report the crimes to company officials and law enforcement. Lee begged Robert to keep quiet about the discovery, offering him a share of the profits in exchange for his silence. But Robert refused to be bought or intimidated, telling his brother that he had a responsibility to report what he had found and that he couldn't be part of covering up criminal activity. The confrontation that followed, deep in the abandoned tunnels of the Black Rock mine, ended with Lee Watson striking his brother with a piece of mining equipment and leaving him to die in one of the mine's deepest chambers. Lee's confession included detailed directions to the location where he had left Robert's body, information that had been tormenting him for decades as he watched his brother's family suffer with not knowing what had happened to their loved one. Following Lee's confession, Tommy Watson contacted law enforcement officials and arranged for a recovery operation to retrieve his father's remains from the location his uncle had described. The operation required specialized equipment and experienced mine rescue personnel, as the chamber where Robert's body had been hidden was located in one of the most dangerous and inaccessible sections of the abandoned mine. When recovery teams finally reached the designated location, they found Robert Watson's remains exactly where Lee had left them 35 years earlier, along with evidence that supported every detail of his brother's confession. The recovery of Robert Watson's body provided closure for a family that had spent decades wondering what had happened to their patriarch. But it also opened new wounds as they struggled to process the reality that Robert had been murdered by someone they had trusted and loved. Lee Watson died of his cancer just weeks after making his confession, taking with him any possibility of legal justice for his crimes, but leaving behind a family forever changed by the knowledge of what he had done. For Tommy Watson, learning the truth about his father's death was both a relief and a devastating blow. The uncertainty that had defined his childhood was finally resolved, but it was replaced by the knowledge that his father had died not as the result of an accident or natural disaster, but because he had been too honest and principled to participate in his brother's criminal enterprise. The discovery also revealed how little Tommy had really known about the adults in his family, and how secrets and criminal activity had been operating just beneath the surface of what he had believed was a normal mining community. The hard truth about family secrets. Robert Watson's story teaches us that sometimes the monsters we fear in the darkness are not supernatural entities or unknown predators, but the people closest to us who are willing to do terrible things to protect their secrets. In tight-knit communities like those found throughout Appalachia, family loyalty and economic desperation can create situations where criminal activity is tolerated or covered up, and where asking too many questions can be dangerous for those who discover uncomfortable truths. The lesson here is that we should trust our instincts when something feels wrong, even when it involves people we love and trust. Robert Watson's commitment to doing the right thing cost him his life, but his integrity also serves as a reminder that some principles are worth maintaining even when they come with serious personal costs. For those living in communities where economic hardship and limited opportunities can tempt people toward criminal activity, Robert's story demonstrates the importance of maintaining moral boundaries and the tragic consequences that can result when those boundaries are crossed. If these true Appalachian horror stories have left you questioning what lurks in the shadows of our most remote places, you're not alone. Every story I've shared tonight represents real people who faced unimaginable terror in the mountains they thought they knew. But here's what haunts me most. For every story I've told you, there are dozens more that remain untold, buried in police files, family secrets, and the collective memory of mountain communities who know better than to speak of certain things out loud. Subscribe to Verified Fears right now and hit that notification bell, because the darkness in the Appalachian Mountains runs deeper than any of us realize, and these stories are just the beginning. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that some places demand respect, some voices should never be answered, and some family secrets are too dangerous to keep silent. The mountains are listening, and they remember everything.